Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we are going to be discussing William Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost. Now, Love's Labour's Lost is our first Shakespeare play. It's the first Shakespeare play that we will be discussing on this podcast. My goal, eventually, is to discuss every one of Shakespeare's plays. It's going to take me several years to get there, I think. But that is the goal, ultimately. I wanted, though, to start with Love's Labour's Lost, partly because it's unconventional, partly because it's not one of Shakespeare's more famous plays. We could have started with Hamlet or Othello or even King Lear, some of the great tragedies, and we could have even started with some of the more famous comedies, Midsummer Night's Dream, etc. But I decided I wanted to start with something that is perhaps not as well known, but a play that for me is very near and dear. I love this play. I think it is one of Shakespeare's masterpieces. I really think it is one of his best plays. And I think that partly because of what the play has to say about some of the topics that, if you've listened to this podcast enough, you know are my favorite things to discuss. Topics such as sensual pleasure, sensory delight, the idea of the senses as a means of understanding the world, as well as the question of love and what is at the heart of love. Love's Labour's Lost is not exactly a celebration of hedonism. I think the play is more exalted than that in its ideas of love, but it is a play that certainly celebrates the senses and explores the question of the senses, in particular the question of the eye. At the root of Love's Labour's Lost is this question of images, visuals, of sight, and how sight, more than words, can lead a person to feel love. We're going to explore this as we see some of the things that Shakespeare the way Shakespeare discusses these themes in the text itself. I also think I wanted to start with one of Shakespeare's comedies because the tragedies are, perhaps rightly, celebrated as Shakespeare's best works, plays like Hamlet and Othello and Macbeth. And it's understandable why, right? These tragedies are profound, moving, and very philosophically dense and rich works, exploring what it means to be human. And we're going to talk about these tragedies in the future as well. But I do think that Shakespeare's comedies are often neglected in comparison to his tragedies. The comedies are, of course, read and celebrated, comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream, but oftentimes I believe the comedies are seen as lighter than Shakespeare's tragedies, and as a result, people dismiss them a little bit more than tragedy. But I think comedy has the potential, and Shakespeare certainly reaches this potential, of in some ways reaching almost a higher level than tragedy. Tragedy hits you, right, with its brutality. It makes you feel this cathartic release as you watch the suffering and failure of these characters. Comedies elevate you. They elevate your spirit. They lift you. They leave you with this feeling that you have risen above the ordinary world to something higher. This idea, this distinction between tragedy and comedy is, of course, an old one, but Joseph Campbell writes really excellently in his Hero with a Thousand Faces about how comedy is not lesser than tragedy, but goes hand in hand with tragedy in the way that it exalts the reader or the audience. So let's talk about Love's Labour's Lost, though, and let's talk about how and in what way it achieves this. In terms of dates, by the way, Love's Labour's Lost is probably written in 1594 or 1595, sometime in the 1590s. That's when scholars date it. The official published version is 1598. This means Love's Labour's Lost is the oldest work we have so far read and explored on this podcast. So in addition to being the first Shakespeare play, it is also the oldest work that we are discussing, and it is the first play. You might challenge that decision. You might say, isn't this supposed to be a podcast about novels? Well, we've done poetry on this podcast. Now we're doing plays. It is ultimately my podcast, and I'll decide what I want to discuss. contemporary novels, classic poems, classic plays, whatever strikes my fancy. And I really felt like I needed Love's Labour's Lost recently. Whenever I feel particularly down about life for whatever reason, a nice Shakespeare comedy is a perfect cleanse, is a perfect way to cleanse the mind of these unpleasant feelings and remind yourself of what really matters. Laughter, wit, humor, bawdy jokes, and ultimately love. Celebrations of love. All right, so let's get into Love's Labour's Lost. So the setup of the play, right, the primary plot of the play is you have these four French noblemen, Ferdinand, who is the king of Navarre, Biron, who is essentially our protagonist, and then Longueville and Dumaine, who are two other noblemen. They're less important as characters, but they complete the foursome, right? The four primary characters, the four men. And the setup is essentially that these four, at the behest of Ferdinand, at the behest of the king, have decided to make vows of asceticism, a vow to study which will prevent them from engaging in sensual pleasure and in particular from seeing women. So let's look at the opening speech of Ferdinand, the very first speech of the play, which I think does a nice job of setting up these central vows and what the goal of the vows are. Let fame, that all hunt after in their lives, live registered upon our brazen tombs, and then grace us in the disgrace of death. When, spite of cormorant devouring time, the endeavor of this present breath may buy that honor which shall bait his side's keen edge, and make us heirs of all eternity. Therefore, brave conquerors, for so you are, at war against your own affections and the huge army of the world's desires, our late edict shall strongly stand in force. Navarre shall be the wonder of the world. Our court shall be a little academe, still and contemplative in living art. You three, Biron, Dumaine, and Longueville, have sworn for 3 years' term to live with me, my fellow scholars, and to keep those statutes that are recorded in this schedule here. Your oaths are passed, and now subscribe your names, that his own hand may strike his honor down, that violates the smallest branch herein. If you are armed to do as sworn to do, subscribe to your deep oaths, and keep it too. So we're going to get into what those oaths are specifically, because they go through some of these oaths in this opening scene. But I want us to note the way the speech begins. Why are they making these oaths? What is the reason they have decided to make these oaths? And it indicates to us here that these oaths are to essentially refrain from what Ferdinand calls the huge army of the world's desires. Now, this is an important extended metaphor that Shakespeare will use throughout this play. He sees these four cavaliers, right, these four courtiers, as soldiers who are fighting against the world's desires. And later, he's going to extend this metaphor when the four women arrive and essentially suggest that love is a kind of battle, right, in which these soldiers are pitted against these women. A battle of wits, a battle of wills. But the other thing Ferdinand says is look at those images at the beginning of this speech. He begins by saying, when we die, we will have these brazen tombs, and death is a disgrace. That's how Ferdinand puts it, the disgrace of death. And he says, we will be famous if we uphold these oaths, and this will grace us in the disgrace of death. It will spite cormorant devouring time. So the cormorant was a bird, right? I think the idea is the bird is basically devouring everything. And so the idea is the time is like a cormorant devouring everything in front of it. There's the scythe's keen edge is also given as an image. And the idea is if they can keep these oaths and create in Navarre this scholarly atmosphere, they will become eternal. They will be heirs of all eternity. So the goal that Ferdinand sets forth at the beginning, the motivation for the goal is to be the heirs of eternity, to basically create some form of eternal life for themselves. In other words, they know they're going to die. How can they stand against time? Well, they can stand against time by taking these oaths, and we're going to see what those oaths are, in order to create in Navarre an academy, right, an academe. The idea here is that that word academy would be suggestive to Shakespeare's audience of Plato's academy, of these old philosophical academies where scholars would come to study. And the idea is these scholars are often taking these oaths of chastity and poverty, etc., right? These oaths against the desires of the world. This is the central thematic tension of the play. Is this the path to knowledge? That's the question Shakespeare is asking. Is an ascetic oath that denies oneself worldly pleasure the path to knowledge? That's what Ferdinand seems to believe here. And as we're going to see, the answer, according to Shakespeare, is no. Shakespeare is going to show through this play that this is a mistaken way of achieving knowledge and, by extension, of achieving immortality or eternity. Remember how the play ends, right? The play ends with the sudden death of the princess's father. And so the play ends with death. The play begins with this image of trying to escape death through these ascetic vows. It ends with death, and it ends with the characters returning to certain vows, though as we're going to see, the vows they come to at the end are different from the vows they begin the play with. And it's going to be important to see how that shift occurs. And I think it's very intelligently structured. It's very pointed that Shakespeare begins the play, a play that is essentially a celebration of life and sensual pleasure, with an image of death. It's sort of foreshadowing for how the play is going to end in some ways. And so we learn over the course of this first scene what some of these oaths entail. They will be fasting to some extent. They will be avoiding rich foods and rich banquets. They will be avoiding wealth and pomp. And they will be avoiding women. That's the key idea. They will be avoiding women. Now, of the three of Ferdinand's companions, of his three courtiers, Longueville and Dumaine agree, but Biron does not. So Biron is different. And so in the first scene, we learn that Biron is not like the other courtiers. He does not agree with Ferdinand's ideas about fasting. He sort of rejects the idea. And in particular, he seems to reject the idea that they're going to avoid seeing a woman. This is important because Biron, we're establishing here that Biron, you could say, is a ladies' man. But also, Biron is articulating a philosophical idea about what is the real source of knowledge that is in some ways opposed to Ferdinand's ideas at the beginning. And this is the central thematic tension of the play. And the question is going to be, who is right? Is it Biron or is it Ferdinand? But let's look at Biron's speech. This is a few lines down in the first scene. Biron says, "Why, all delights are vain, but that most vain which with pain purchased doth inherit pain, as painfully to pore upon a book, to seek the light of truth, while truth the while doth falsely blind the eyesight of his look. Light seeking light doth light of light beguile. So ere you find where light in darkness lies, your light grows dark by losing of your eyes." So this is one of the key ideas, this emphasis on light and eyesight. So let's break down these few lines. So he's sort of saying that it's going to be, because this is in response to Ferdinand's line where he says, we are going to train our intellect to vain delight. And Biron basically says, well, this is the most vain, right, to believe you can do this. So he says, when you painfully pore upon a book to seek the light of truth. So he's going to use the word light in several different ways in this speech. So first, he uses the word light to refer to the light of truth. This is a common image associated with the intellect, with knowledge. Knowledge is often associated with light. Think of the word enlightenment or enlighten. So the idea is Biron is telling Ferdinand, you're going to painfully pore upon a book to seek the light of truth. But the truth doth falsely blind the eyesight of his look. So he's going to argue that in poring over this book, you are actually going to blind yourself. The idea of the eyes as the source of truth is really important in this play, because later, all of these men are going to look at the four women, and they're going to fall in love. They're going to be struck by what they see. And Shakespeare is really going to contrast the idea of words versus sight. Whom do you learn more from? Your sight, your eyes, or what you read? Words. Or what you hear, right? Words. And especially because if you think about it, the key oath that Biron is opposed to here, the oath that he doesn't like, is the idea that they're not allowed to look upon a woman. The idea of looking is important. Biron doesn't like the idea that they're going to avoid looking at women, because he understands that the sight, looking upon a woman, is the path to love and to knowledge. That's what he's going to learn by the end of the play. So then he says, you're going to go blind, and then we have this wonderful line, light seeking light doth light of light beguile. So in other words, he's using the word light in sort of a double meaning, right? So in other words, he's saying when you're seeking light, when you're seeking knowledge, you are actually blinding yourself, your eyesight. Light of light beguile. So in other words, if we pursue this path, he's saying, if we pursue this type of intellectualism, we will go blind. Now, if we keep reading this speech, there's more to it. So ere you find where light in darkness lies, your light grows dark by losing of your eyes. Study me how to please the eye indeed, by fixing it upon a fairer eye, who, dazzling so, that eye shall be his heed, and give him light that it was blinded by. Study is like the heaven's glorious sun, that will not be deep searched with saucy looks. Small have continual plodders ever won, save base authority from others' books, these earthly godfathers of heaven's lights, that give a name to every fixed star, have no more profit of their shining nights than those that walk and wot not what they are. Too much to know is to know naught but fame, and every godfather can give a name. So what is he saying in this section? He's saying basically the key to knowledge, the key to studying is to fix your eye upon a fairer eye. So in other words, he's saying look at someone who is fair, who is beautiful, and that person will dazzle you, and you will no longer be blind, right? She will give you the light. And that's what's going to happen to all these characters. They're going to look and see these women, and they're going to fall in love. That's what's going to happen to Biron himself. Then he compares study to the sun, and he basically says you're not going to, you can't deep search the sun by looking at it. The idea is you're not going to gain anything by looking at the sun. And then he says, when you have these plodders, these people who are studying so hard, all they win is authority from other people's books. He says they're like godfathers, the godfathers of heaven's lights that give a name to every fixed star. They can name all the stars, he's saying. They look at the sky and they have a name for every star, but they don't profit from these shining nights any more than people who have no idea what the stars are. Again, he's creating this contrast between the intellect and the experience. And he's suggesting that, the intellect cannot make up for the lack of experience. So this is Biron's kind of challenge to Ferdinand. And for now, they don't agree with him. And even though he disagrees with Ferdinand, he's still going to sign the oath. He says, I told myself I was here with you, my friend, and I'm going to be here. I'm not going to break my oath. So even though Biron has his reservations, he still signs the oath at the beginning. And so that's kind of the main characters of the play, these four and the oath they take. And very quickly we learn that this oath might be tested because, as Ferdinand has learned, the Princess of France is here. And they're supposed to meet to discuss some matter of the surrender of Aquitaine, some, political detail, essentially. The point of what they're here to discuss doesn't matter as much. The idea is, this is going to throw a wrench into Ferdinand's plans to live this scholarly life for the next 3 years where he's not going to see any women. He realizes, I'm going to have to see this woman. And there's something quite funny and comical about the way Shakespeare writes that little moment, right? Biron reminds him, right, well, you say that if any man be seen to talk with a woman within the term of 3 years, he shall endure such public shame as the rest of the court can possibly devise. And he says, you're going to have to break this because the Princess of France is here. And Ferdinand's reply is, what say you, lords? Why, this was quite forgot. I mean, he literally just says, I forgot. There's something comical about it. I think Shakespeare's intention is to slightly undermine the gravity of Ferdinand as a character. The fact that he's so self-serious about studying and being a scholar, but he forgets this task that he has, right? Having to meet with the Princess of France. And what they're going to sort of do is basically prevent the princess and her ladies from actually entering the court. They're going to force them to stay outside. And it's going to create this kind of fascinating little play between them, right? As they almost battle each other over wit and affection. The other plot line that is introduced in this opening act is the secondary character, Don Armado. Now, Don Armado is another courtier. He's from Spain, and to some extent it is Shakespeare mocking the Spanish, who were, historically at the time one of England's big enemies, right? So Shakespeare is mocking the Spanish courtier. I think Don Armado is also meant to be a kind of comic reflection of the primary plot line. Basically, he is in love with a maid named Jaquenetta. And the idea is Don Armado is a nobleman and Jaquenetta is a common woman. And Don Armado's attempts to pursue Jaquenetta are in some ways contrasted to the more high-minded love stories of the other four characters. And I think Shakespeare very consciously creates a foil between them. And our first introduction to Don Armado, our first introduction to Don Armado is not Armado himself, but a letter that he has written to the king, essentially accusing the fool Costard. So Costard is the fool in the play, essentially accusing Costard of having sexual relations with Jaquenetta, in violation of the king's orders, the king's oaths, essentially. I think this is, again, meant to be comedic, meant to be humorous. Don Armado and Costard and Jaquenetta, they are kind of this comedic foil to the four courtiers. But I really like this letter because Shakespeare does a really good job of parodying certain high-minded and artificial language associated with love. Don Armado writes in a style that is so florid and so quote-unquote learned that it becomes essentially laughable. So what Shakespeare is doing, I believe, with Don Armado, as well as with some of the later characters we will meet, is he is satirizing the overly intellectual. He is satirizing the characters who take this overly intellectual view of love. So Ferdinand basically reads the letter out loud. And listen to the kind of rhythms of the letter and the words and images that he uses to really satirize this style of thinking and speaking. So it is, besieged with sable-colored melancholy, I did commend the black-oppressing humor to the most wholesome physic of thy health-giving air, and, as I am a gentleman, betook myself to walk. The time when, about the 6th hour, when beasts most graze, birds best peck, and men sit down to that nourishment which is called supper, so much for the time when. Now for the ground which, I mean, I walked upon, it is yclept thy park. Then, for the place where I mean, I did encounter that obscene and preposterous event, that draweth from my snow-white pen the eben-coloured ink, which here thou viewest, beholdest, surveyest, or seest. So if we pause in this speech, we can see the way that Shakespeare is making fun of this style. Essentially, Don Armado is so verbose that he cannot simply tell a story. He cannot simply tell Ferdinand what happened. He has to belabor every point, the when and the where, right? So the when, he says, it is about the 6th hour when the beasts most graze, right? He's making fun of someone simply saying 6 o'clock. Instead of simply saying 6 o'clock, Don Armado has to have 3 or 4 different images, similes, metaphors, etc., 3 or 4 different associations to make that point. Same thing with this phrase, which here thou viewest, beholdest, surveyest, or seest. So 4 words, all of which mean the same thing. You're reading this letter that I wrote. Also, the idea itself doesn't even need to be said. So the point is, Don Armado's letter is so over the top in the way it's written that it becomes a satire of, it's clearly a satire of this type of intellectualism. And remember, Ferdinand claims to want to pursue this. Ferdinand at the beginning says, we are here to study and become learned men. That's what Shakespeare sets up. And then here we have a letter from a supposedly learned man, which is ridiculous, which is intended to make the audience laugh. So Shakespeare is satirizing intellectualism, satirizing the overly intellectual way of looking at the world and of writing. So here's the other thing that's going to be important. This is a play in which letters that characters write are going to have a really important function. And one of the things that we're going to see is that for Shakespeare, these letters are insufficient in comparison to reality. One of the other tensions of this novel is the difference between the written word, right? These written declarations later of love that a lot of characters will write, in contrast to actual encounters. So think about what we have here, right? Don Armado is writing this letter accusing Costard, basically, of having sex with Jaconetta. Already we have this contrast between the lower character, Costard, the sort of foolish peasant character who has sex, who has this vitality about him, in contrast to Don Armado, the nobleman who writes these florid but ultimately meaningless letters. So I think the contrast between Don Armado and Costard here is important. If we keep reading the letter, one of the funniest kind of parts of the letter, he's saying that Costard, sordid and consorted, contrary to thy established proclaimed edict and continent canon, which with, but with this I passion to say wherewith. So Ferdinand is reading the letter, and Costard interrupts him and says, with a wench. So Costard just admits it. He says, yeah, I had sex with a woman. I had sex with a wench. But Ferdinand is reading Don Armado's letter, and Armado is still going, is still verbose. With a child of our grandmother Eve, a female, or, for thy more sweet understanding, a woman. Again, the humor of the moment is Costard, the peasant character, the fool, he is direct. He will just say a wench. Don Armado, the verbose intellectual, can't even just say a wench. He has to say a child of our grandmother Eve, a female, or a woman. Instead of one word, he has 3 words for it. And again, so it's this critique, it's this satire of this overly intellectual, overly florid style of speaking. I think what's important for readers is, as we're going to see, Don Armado is really a parallel, a foil to Biron specifically. So, because later, they're both going to write letters to the women that they love. Don Armado is going to write a letter to Jaconetta. Biron is going to write a letter to Rosalind. And Costard is going to accidentally switch the letters. And so Biron and Don Armado are linked in this way. They are both aristocrats. They're both noblemen. They're both writing letters to the women they love. They're sort of parallel in some ways, even though Don Armado is meant to be ridiculous and a caricature of the nobleman intellectual, whereas Biron is our protagonist. Biron has this irony about him that we appreciate, this irony and this wit. So then in Act 2, we meet the women. So the women are fascinating because the women, obviously, they clearly correspond to the men. And we see them, when we meet them, talk about the different men. And so we immediately understand which woman is going to be paired with which man. But I want us to look at the princess's speech. So In terms of the women, right, Rosalind is the one who falls in love with Biron. So you might think she is the main woman. She's the most important woman. But really, I believe it's the princess who is the most important of the female characters. The princess who is the one who's going to fall in love with Ferdinand, and the one who Ferdinand is going to fall in love with. The princess has certain speeches in this play that articulate a vision of love that I believe is Shakespeare's vision of love. She articulates a vision of love that in some ways comes in contrast with some of the other characters. So let's look at the opening speech of the princess. So she's talking to Boyette, who is basically the go-between between the princess and the men. He's sort of one of the princess's advisors. She speaks to him, though, at the beginning. And let's look at this speech from the princess. This is at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 1. Good Lord Boyette, my beauty, though but mean, needs not the painted flourish of your praise. Beauty is bought by judgment of the eye, not uttered by base sale of chapmen's tongues. So that's the first key contrast that she sets up. She's saying her beauty does not need to be described, does not need to be praised. She is saying beauty comes from the eye's judgment. It does not need to be sold by the tongue. Now, this is fascinating because I think what's so deliciously ironic about all of this is, yes, you would normally see this play performed on stage. So you would see the actress who played the princess, though, of course, in Shakespeare's time, it would have been an actor. But for us, reading this play today, there are no images. We don't see anything. The power comes only from the words. So the double layer of irony here to reading this play is this is a play that basically says beauty that the eye can sort of see, that the eye notices, is so much more powerful than the beauty that the tongue describes. But the irony is we don't have anything visual here. It's all stuff that Shakespeare's tongue describes. It's all stuff that Shakespeare's words are describing. So I think this is kind of Shakespeare's ironic celebration of himself as a poet. He's kind of saying in this play, beauty is something that only the eye can judge. Words will never be sufficient to describe someone's beauty, except my words, because I'm Shakespeare, and I'm great. That's essentially what he's suggesting or implying here, right? He's criticizing the idea that words can convey an idea of beauty, but in order to make this point, he has to use only words because he has no images. And this is the delicious and wonderful irony, I think, of the written word. So many poets do things like this. So many writers do things like this. If you remember our episode on John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn from a few weeks ago, there was this false modesty to the way Keats said, oh, my rhyme will never be as powerful as the images on the urn. Of course, Keats was wrong. His rhyme becomes more eternal, more sublime than the images on the urn. Shakespeare is saying the same thing here. He's sort of saying, you know what? Words, the written words, what the tongue can speak or say is never going to be as powerful as what the eye can see. But it's technically not true, because here we have words, language that is still eternal. The language to describe beauty, the language to describe this princess, this fictional character's beauty, that has survived, and it still moves us, no matter what the image is, right? The images will change with each performance, but the words are the words. So I just love that because I think in the context of the play, Shakespeare is making a point about language versus sight. On a meta level, on a metatextual level, Shakespeare is making a different, more ironic point about the power of his own play, about the power of his own words. So the rest of the scene, right, the men come out and meet the women, so they exchange witty banter, right? Much of the meat of this play is made up of these witty little exchanges between the different characters, right? Between Rosalind and Biron, for example, right? Let me just give you a little taste of some of that wit. We won't have time to read all of these little witty exchanges, but I think it's important not to skip some of them because they do really capture what gives the play its energy, right? The play's energy is carried by these witty exchanges between the ladies and the men. The idea is these ladies are very smart. They're very quick. They're very sharp. they can not only keep up with the men, they outpace the men when it comes to wit. They are better than the men. Later, we're going to see Costard basically praise the women. He delivers a letter to the women, he witnesses a display of wit, and he basically praises the women for being the wittiest people he's seen. But let's look at one of these little witty exchanges. So this is Biron talking to Rosalind. And I'm just going to try and read the lines quickly, because I think part of the joy of reading this play is the back and forth, the bounce of this banter. So Biron speaks first. "Did not I dance with you in Brabant once?" And Rosalind replies, "Did not I dance with you in Brabant once?" So a nice little witty retort, repeating the same exact line back to him. Why is that so funny? It's because the answer to his question is yes, he did dance with her once, but she reframes it and makes herself the subject, right? From a grammatical perspective, she wants to be the subject. She's the one with agency. That's the tension of these witty games. Who is really in charge? The men want the women. The women, they like the men, but they don't want to give in to the men. They want to challenge the men, and they want the men to give in to them. So it's this back and forth, this challenge of who is really in power. It's the play of love, right? It's the game of love where you have to best the other person through wit and through your will. And so Rosalind here is defending herself, so to speak, against Biron. This kind of metaphor of fighting is not an accidental one. Shakespeare uses this over and over and over again. He describes the ladies at one point as people who have come to besiege the king's court. And remember, the ladies are not allowed into the court. They are outside the court in a tent. So they are quite literally like an army who has come to besiege Ferdinand and the court at Navarre. So continuing this witty banter. "Did I not dance with you in Brabant once? Did I not dance with you in Brabant once? I know you did. How needless was it then to ask the question? You must not be so quick. 'Tis long of you that spur me with such questions. Your wit's too hot, it speeds too fast, 'twill tire. Not till it leave the rider in the mire." So we have this back and forth between Rosalind and Biron, and basically she sort of bests him. She keeps up with his wordplay and throws him wordplay of her own. She says, "How needless was it then to ask the question?" Right, so she makes fun of him for asking the question, and he's like, "Oh, you shouldn't be so quick," as in quick-witted. And she said, "Well, you're the one who's spurring me with such questions." And so there's a double meaning of the word spur in that case. The idea is Rosalind is like a horse being spurred. Biron is like a rider. And, he says, "Oh, your wit's too hot. It's going to speed too fast." And she said, "Oh, it's going to leave the rider in the mire." Remember, Biron is the rider in this extended metaphor that they're carrying on between themselves. And so the idea is she's going to leave Biron in the dust. So the idea is basically they're using wordplay and kind of, it's almost like, I like to imagine it as the metaphor that they've created is like a little tennis ball. It's like a little shuttlecock. They're hitting it between each other, right? That's a nice little, I think, way of thinking of what this kind of wit and wordplay is doing. And this is kind of characteristic of the whole play. Many scenes between them have a lot of this type of wit, the kind of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between Rosalind and Biron, as well as between all of the characters. All four of them have variations of this in the play. So I want to jump ahead to Act 4, because this is really where everything comes to a head, where all the different plot threads converge, and in this particular play, Act 4 is really the fulcrum, the turning point, because as we're going to see, this is where it's essentially revealed that all of the king's courtiers are breaking their oaths to try and see the women that they've fallen in love with, and Biron has his big speech, which is essentially the big thematic articulation of Shakespeare's ideas. But for now, let's look at Act 4, and I want to look particularly at the two letters. So obviously the central plot point here is the two letters that have been written, one by Don Armado to Jaquenetta, and one by Biron to Rosalind. And as with a lot of Shakespeare, the central tension is that Costard, the fool, accidentally swaps the letters, accidentally switches the letters. And these letters are, of course, really important for making Shakespeare's point because, as we said, there's a parallel, a mirror between Biron and Don Armado. Don Armado is foolish and silly. Biron is courtly and sophisticated. And yet Shakespeare is suggesting they're not that different. Why are they not that different? Because they both believe that it is through words that they will win the hearts of their beloveds, that it is through words and not sight. And through these letters, Shakespeare is ironically going to undermine the very power of words to express, convey, and achieve the idea of love. So let's first look at Don Armado's letter, which is meant to be the silly version, the silly variation, the foolish variation. So this is in Act 4, Scene 1. Basically, the Costard delivers this letter to the princess and to Rosalind, and Boyet reads it out loud. And it's much like Don Armado's previous letter to Ferdinand, this is a wonderful parody of an overly pedantic and overly scholarly way of writing. So, by heaven, that thou art fair is most infallible. So remember, this is Don Armado writing to Jaconetta. True that thou art beauteous, truth itself that thou art lovely. More fairer than fair, beautiful than beauteous, truer than truth itself, have commiseration on thy heroical vassal. The magnanimous and most illustrate king, Cophetua, set eye upon the pernicious and indubit beggar Xenophon, and he it was that might rightly say, Veni, vidi, vici, which, to anathenize in the vulgar, O base and obscure vulgar, videlicet, he came, he saw, and overcame. He came one, saw two, overcame three. Now, before we go on, let's just kind of analyze the first few lines here of this kind of parody of scholastic and this parody of academic language. So first, remember, this is a love letter. This is meant to be a love letter. This is meant to be Don Armado conveying to Jaconetta how much he loves her. But how is he trying to convince her? He is trying to convince her through logos, through logic. He begins by saying, the fact that you are fair is infallible, as in it's logically impossible that you are not fair. It's true that you are beauteous, and it's true that you are lovely. Shakespeare loves, when he's satirizing Don Armado and these academics, he loves making fun of the fact that they list things in three. This is a really funny, I think, in light of the fact that these days we have our own variation of this in the form of ChatGPT, which also loves lists of three. There's something, what Shakespeare is making fun of is the fact that in traditional rhetoric, a list of three was considered the most persuasive. And Shakespeare's kind of making fun of the overly pedantic way that a character like Don Armado insists upon these lists of three. It's kind of funny, I think, because, we make fun of ChatGPT for the same way. This is why ChatGPT could never write a great love letter, because it would be, like Don Armado, overly pedantic, overly technical with its lists of three, following the rules of rhetoric too closely, lacking that human aspect. Then he has this kind of ridiculous allusion, right? This ridiculous allusion. So here, Shakespeare is making fun of the fact that these learned gentlemen are obsessed with their own learning and continue to make references to these obscure biblical or historical figure. Now, personally, I don't know who King Cophetua and Xenophon are. I could look them up if I wanted, but I think Shakespeare's point is that don't worry about it. It's irrelevant. It's a stupid illusion, right? It's a funny illusion. Perhaps if I looked it up, I could see there's an extra layer of humor there. But I'm actually not going to look it up because I think the point in the speech is that to Jaconetta, this illusion would be meaningless. Remember, she's a peasant girl. She doesn't know who King Cophetua or Xenophon are. So again, it's meant to be Shakespeare making fun of the way Don Armado writes a love letter. Then he uses the famous phrase, Veni, vidi, vici. It's Julius Caesar's famous phrase. He came, he saw, he conquered. But let's look at the way he's going to in an extremely pedantic and scholarly way, break down the meaning of each of these points. This is very similar to the satire we saw earlier when Don Armado, in exhaustive detail, broke down the when and the where of his first letter to Ferdinand accusing Costard and Jaquenetta of fraternizing. So here, who came? The king. Why did he come? To see. Why did he see? To overcome. To whom came he? To the beggar. What saw he? The beggar. Who overcame he? The beggar. The conclusion is victory. On whose side? The king's. The captive is enriched. On whose side? The beggar's. The catastrophe is a nuptial. On whose side? The king's. No, on both in one, or one in both. I am the king, for so stands the comparison. Thou the beggar, for so witnesseth thy lowliness. Shall I command thy love? I may. Shall I enforce thy love? I could. Shall I entreat thy love? I will. What shalt thou exchange for rags? Robes. For titles? Titles. For thyself? Me. Thus, expecting thy reply, I profane my lips on thy foot, my eyes on thy picture, and my heart on thy every part. Thine, in the dearest design of industry, Don Adriano de Armado. Now, again, the humor of that is, remember, this is the love letter. He's trying to tell Jaquenetta that he loves her. And look at the way he does it. He goes through the Veni Vidi Vici, he lists what each of those means, and then he very exhaustively describes how he is the king and she is the beggar. He explains the allusion to her, just in case she doesn't get it. And notice the pattern that Shakespeare writes in. It's this question and answer. Question and answer. He's making fun of the logicians. He's making fun of the rhetoricians who obsess with this overly pedantic, logical approach to thinking, speaking, and writing, where they continually ask themselves questions and then answer it. It's actually very similar to, there's a chapter in Ulysses towards the end. When we get to our podcast on Ulysses, we'll talk about this. There's a chapter in Ulysses at the end where Joyce makes fun of this same style of writing. Though Joyce has a slightly different, he has a little bit more of sympathy toward the intellectuals than Shakespeare does. But here, right, Shakespeare's making fun of the intellectuals through this question and answer pattern. Question and answer, question and answer. And even the ending, Don Armado, when he signs off his letter, can't help but list three things, right? He profanes his lips on her foot, his eyes on her picture, and his heart on thy every part. Shakespeare's also making fun of the fact that the rhyme there, right, heart and part, is very awkward, right? It's an awkward final rhyme. And so through this letter, through this kind of bizarre love letter that Don Armado writes to Jaquenetta, we as the readers are meant to realize the absurdity and foolishness of this type of declaration of love, of a declaration of love purely based on words and logic and the way a learned man thinks of love. We're going to contrast this to Biron in a moment. But the idea here is that, the princess and Boyette and all the ladies and Costard, they all make fun of Don Armado for this ridiculous declaration of love. And they also obviously realize that this letter was misdelivered. Now, let's jump to later in Act 4, right, where we see Biron's letter. This is now in Act 4, Scene 2. Now, in this scene, we are introduced to two minor characters, Sir Nathaniel and Holofernes. These are also two satires of intellectuals, of learned men. Through these two characters, Shakespeare is making fun of, again, the scholarly approach to life and the scholarly attitude. Especially Holofernes really just loves to quote Latin all the time, right? They're constantly quoting Latin at each other. And later, Shakespeare is going to complete the parody by having them perform a play alongside Costard and Don Armado and some of the other silly characters in Act 5. But for now, we have Holofernes and Sir Nathaniel essentially reading Biron's letter out loud. And again, it's been misdelivered, right? This letter delivered to Jaquenetta that should have been delivered to Rosalind. So let's look at the letter here. If love make me forsworn, how shall I swear to love? Ah, never faith could hold, if not to beauty vowed, though to myself forsworn, to thee I'll faithful prove. Those thoughts to me were oaks, to thee like osiers bowed. Study his bias leaves and makes his book thine eyes, where all those pleasures live that art would comprehend. If knowledge be the mark, to know thee shall suffice. Well learned is that tongue that well can thee commend. All ignorant that soul that sees thee without wonder, which is to me some praise that I thy parts admire. Thy eye Jove's lightning bears, thy voice his dreadful thunder, which not to anger bent, is music and sweet fire. Celestial as thou art, O pardon, love, this wrong, that sings heaven's praise with such an earthly tongue. Now contrast that with, and this is basically a sonnet, I believe, right? It's meant to be a kind of sonnet. Contrast that sonnet, kind of technically perfect sonnet, 14 lines, nice rhyme scheme, right, concluding with the heroic couplet, iambic pentameter. Contrast that with the prose passage that we read earlier from Don Armado, which did not have the sonnet's rhythm, the iambic pentameter, which was written in a kind of ugly, pedantic, academic prose style. So clearly, Biron is adept at writing. He is adept at love and expressing his love in a way that Don Armado is not. This sonnet is quite well done. This letter to Rosalind, misdelivered here to Jacanetta, is quite well written. So it begins with this question of the oath that he has sworn. And he essentially says, well, I'm going to forswear my oath. I'm going to break my oath by falling in love with you, but I will be faithful to you. He's contrasting the idea of being faithful to his oath that he took with Ferdinand to study and to fast and to see no woman. And he's contrasting that with what he believes is the greater duty, the duty to love, now that he has fallen in love with Rosalind. And he basically contrasts, and this is kind of the central contrast of the play, he contrasts the idea of studying books, learning, intellectualism, with the knowledge that comes from looking into Rosalind's eyes, right? He says, study his bias leaves and makes his book thine eyes. In other words, he's saying to Rosalind, more important than the book than any book that I could study would be your eyes. And he says, if knowledge be the mark, in other words, if knowledge is my goal, then knowing thee shall suffice. He is saying, why should I focus on studying when all that really matters is knowing you? So he's taking the goal that he and Ferdinand and all the men pledged themselves to at the beginning, studying, knowledge, etc., and he's flipping it and saying, actually, all that matters is studying you, Rosalind. He says, well learned is that tongue that well can thee commend. In other words, to be a truly learned tongue is one that can commend Rosalind. And he has this great line about Jove's lightning, right? In other words, he's saying to Rosalind, your eyes are like Jove's lightning. Your voice is like Jove's thunder, but it's not anger. It's music and sweet fire. He is saying that she is celestial. And he says, pardon, love, this wrong that sings heaven's praise with such an earthly tongue. So this final section makes an interesting contrast. So on the one hand, he's saying, yeah, I'm going to forget about studying and knowledge because what matters is you. Knowing you, studying you, loving you is more important than the oath that I've pledged. But he also says that she is like a god. She is like Jove. She is celestial, and his tongue is earthly. So he concludes this stanza, he concludes this sonnet with a second point that Shakespeare is making, which we will see more of in Act 5, which is the idea that even this sonnet is insufficient to express and capture what it means to love Rosalind. And this is the second point that Shakespeare makes. Beyond the critique of intellectualism and knowledge, he is also saying that words themselves, even beautiful words uttered by someone as learned as Biron, as adept and skillful and artistic as Biron, even words like this are insufficient, right? They represent an earthly tongue, but she is celestial. She is heavenly. And we're going to see this, right? We're going to see this tension resolve in the final section as well, when Biron and all the men realize that even their beautiful sonnets are meaningless. That even these kinds of words are insufficient. And this is the ultimate kind of irony and playfulness that Shakespeare has here. He contrasts Don Armado and Biron. He parallels them, he mirrors them, and he really wants to emphasize, Don Armado is silly and foolish and pedantic, and Biron is, ironic and witty and adept and intelligent and sophisticated and artistic. But regardless of the difference between them, they are both flawed because they rely too much on words, on the earthly tongue to express something that Shakespeare is saying is actually celestial, is actually beyond words themselves. And we're going to see how Act 5 pays this off. Now, the next speech I want to look at, though, is still in Act 4. So Act 4, Scene 3, this is the big scene. This is the scene where the four men realize that they are all writing sonnets and love letters to the women. They are all on the verge of breaking their oaths. And in this scene, Biron has, right, his great speech. Biron has what is essentially the big speech of the play. This is the most important speech of the play. This is where he basically expresses the play's central idea. So I want to take a moment to really look at this speech in detail. This is Act 4, Scene 3. And basically, Biron is challenging the very idea of the oath that Ferdinand set on them at the beginning of the play. "'Tis more than need. Have at you then, affection's men at arms. Consider what you first did swear unto. To fast, to study, and to see no woman, flat treason 'gainst the kingly state of youth." So he sets this up by saying the very oaths you took at the beginning of the play were treason. So he also refers to them as affection's men at arms. Men at arms is a term referring to soldiers, to warriors, to knights, basically, to fighters. It's extending this metaphor that Shakespeare has used throughout, that the four men, the four courtiers, are like soldiers fighting this battle. Originally, they were fighting this battle against the world's desires to try and maintain their scholarly and ascetic oath. Now they are men at arms because they are affection's men at arms. They are fighting on behalf of love to win the hearts of these ladies. And Biron is saying to them, actually, that oath you swore at the beginning, it was treason. This is a wonderful metaphor. I love this metaphor. Flat treason against the kingly state of youth. Now, I'll confess, I actually love this line so much, I used it as the epigraph in my own novel, Portrait of Sebastian Kahn. So that's why I have a soft spot for this speech in particular, because I think this speech, I use this line with intention as the epigraph for my novel, for my first novel. Flat treason against the kingly state of youth. So he is taking the idea of the oath and turning it on its head. He's saying, actually, by swearing the oath, we committed treason against our youth. Because he's saying we are young. We should not be committing ourselves to such asceticism. If we keep reading, "Say, can you fast? Your stomachs are too young, and abstinence engenders maladies. And where that you have vowed to study, lords, in that each of you have forsworn his book, can you still dream and pore and thereon look? For when would you, my lord, or you, have found the ground of study's excellence without the beauty of a woman's face?" So he's saying to them, it's also wrong to reject seeing a woman, because how could you really study without the knowledge of the beauty of a woman's face? Again, he's returning to that point he made in the sonnet that he wrote to Rosalind, where he said, actually, the only knowledge and the only study that matters is to study the women we love. Again, it's that distinction between the eye, what the eye sees. Does knowledge come from what the eye sees, Or does knowledge come from the mind and the tongue? Shakespeare is saying, no, the eye is the true source of knowledge. If we keep reading, why, universal plodding poisons up the nimble spirits in the arteries, as motion and long-during action tires the sinewy vigor of the traveler. So the word plodding, it's kind of his way of describing what studying feels like, what this ascetic lifestyle of studying in this academy feels like. It's plodding. And he's saying it poisons our nimble spirits, right? It poisons our nimble spirits. It destroys our youth, he's saying, right? The nimble spirits in the arteries. In the same way that if that a traveler can grow tired from long action and motion. Now, for not looking on a woman's face, you have in that forsworn the use of eyes, and study too, the causer of your vow. So he's saying, ironically, by vowing to not look at a woman, you've actually forsworn your own eyes. Again, the emphasis on the eyes. Biron is saying the eyes matter the most. The eyes matter the most. What you see matters the most. Continuing on, for where is any author in the world teaches such beauty as a woman's eye? So he's saying that the truest author is not the author of a book, but a woman's eye. Again, he's comparing a woman's eye, or contrasting, we should say, a woman's eye to a book. Learning is but an adjunct to ourself, and where we are, our learning likewise is. Then, when ourselves we see in ladies' eyes, do we not likewise see our learning there? Oh, we have made a vow to study, lords, and in that vow we have forsworn our books. What does he mean by that? The real books, the true books, are women's eyes. He's saying by swearing to study and swearing to avoid women, we have actually forsworn ourselves because we are avoiding the thing that will teach us more than any book, a woman's eye. For when would you, my liege, or you, in leaden contemplation, have found out such fiery numbers as the prompting eyes of beauty's tutors have enriched you with? So he's asking a rhetorical question to all of them. He's saying, is there any book, right, that we would read in leaden contemplation? Again, the word leaden, kind of like the word plodding, suggesting this heaviness that accompanies overly ascetic forms of studying. He's saying we will never find anything worthwhile compared to the fiery numbers that we get from a woman's eyes. Again, look at the words he's using to create this contrast. The leaden and plodding associations of study versus the fiery passion of true love that you see in a woman's eyes. Other slow arts entirely keep the brain, and therefore, finding barren practisers, scarce show a harvest of their heavy toil. Again, the toil of scholarship is heavy, and it does not lead to a harvest. It leads to a barren brain. So now he's using a different metaphor, this idea of agriculture, this idea of growth, this idea of crops growing, the barren brain that does not produce a harvest. But love, first learned in a lady's eyes, lives not alone immured in the brain, but with the motion of all elements, courses as swift as thought in every power, and gives to every power a double power above their function and their offices. So now he's going to say when you look at a woman and when you fall in love with a woman, it's not just in your brain. What he says is it lives not alone immured in the brain, but with the motion of all elements, courses as swift as thought in every power. So he's saying, like, when you fall in love, it's not just in your head, it's not just in your brain, like knowledge, like scholarly knowledge, but it flows and courses through you. It's like blood in your veins, right? And it affects, he says, every other power. Now he's going to list those other powers to show how love enhances everything. It adds a precious seeing to the eye. A lover's eyes will gaze an eagle blind. A lover's ear will hear the lowest sound when the suspicious head of theft is stopped. Love's feeling is more soft and sensible than are the tender horns of cockled snails. Love's tongues proves dainty Bacchus, gross in taste. For valor, is not love a Hercules, still climbing trees in the Hesperides? So, what he's saying about love here is that it enhances all the senses. It makes your eyes stronger than an eagle's eyes. It makes your ears able to hear the lowest sound. It makes your feeling soft and sensible. It makes your taste so exquisite that even Bacchus's taste would seem gross. Bacchus is the god of wine, Dionysus, the god of revelry. It's important that Shakespeare is going through the senses here. For Shakespeare, love is about the senses. This is another central tension in the play. Because at the beginning, remember, Ferdinand and Biron and all of them, the oath they swore was essentially an oath against the senses, right? They chose an ascetic life of scholarship in their little academy in opposition to sensory delight. And Biron is saying, actually, sensory delight and love matters more. It's important, though, that this is not a purely Epicurean statement. He's not simply saying, let's just be hedonists and focus on the senses. He is saying, actually, we have to fall in love first, right? It's actually much more Neoplatonic than anything else. He is saying, first we fall in love. First we experience this transcendent and celestial vision of love. Then that vision of love heightens the senses. So it's wrong, I think, to think of Love's Labour's Lost as a celebration of hedonism or a pure celebration of hedonism. Instead, more intelligently, Shakespeare is saying, for this hedonism to be effective and to matter, first you must be in love. And this love heightens your senses, as Biron is saying. But the larger point is that this is preferable and better than the ascetic vow that the characters took at the beginning. If we keep reading, subtle as Sphinx, as sweet and musical as bright Apollo's lute, strung with his hair. And when love speaks, the voice of all the gods makes heaven drowsy with the harmony. So he's comparing love here to a variety of different gods and heroes, a variety of different classical references. Hercules, the Sphinx, Apollo, the gods. Never durst poet touch a pen to write until his ink were tempered with love's sighs. Oh, then his lines would ravish savage ears and plant in tyrants mild humility. So he says, love has the power to make tyrants mild. Love is the reason poets write. And now we get the key lines that I think the kind of peroration, the climax of this speech, the lines that this whole speech has been building to. From women's eyes, this doctrine I derive. They sparkle still, the right Promethean fire. They are the books, the arts, the academes that show, contain, and nourish all the world. Else none at all in aught proves excellent. So he's saying women's eyes, and again, the emphasis on the eyes is so important. It's not just women in general, but their eyes. For Shakespeare, for Biron, and for Shakespeare, it's not just looking at a woman, but looking at a woman's eyes, because the idea is they're gazing back at you, and it's that mutual gaze that engenders and creates this feeling of love. And he is saying, in a woman's eyes, you have the Promethean fire. I love that because that is obviously the essence of what it means to be human, right? The essence of humanity and of the world, the Promethean fire. And he says, in those eyes are all the books and arts and academes, all the things we wanted to study. He's essentially saying to Ferdinand, all the things you wanted to study, they're right there. They are in a woman's eyes, and you forswore to look at women, and in doing so you rejected the source of true knowledge. This is Shakespeare's ultimate point in Love's Labour's Lost, that true knowledge does not come from books or studying or words. It comes from a woman's eyes. And I think that's a very profound statement about love, especially for a playwright who makes his living and reputation on language to say. If we finish this speech, then fools you were these women to forswear, or keeping what is sworn, you will prove fools. For wisdom's sake, a word that all men love, or for love's sake, a word that loves all men, or for men's sake, the authors of these women, or for women's sake, by whom we men are men, let us once lose our oaths to find ourselves, or else we lose ourselves to keep our oaths. It is religion to be thus forsworn, for charity itself fulfills the law, and who can sever love from charity? So he's saying, let us reject the oaths we have sworn, but let's do it for the sake of wisdom, love, men, and women. He goes through those four: wisdom's sake, love's sake, men's sake, and women's sake. And he says we need to reject these oaths, and it's actually better, it is religion for us to reject these oaths, because it is wrong for us to keep them. And this speech basically convinces the four of them. They hear this speech, and they agree. And that's why this speech is the pivot point of the play. It's kind of the climax of the play in some ways, because they realize that they were wrong to make this oath, and they decide, let us reject this oath, and let us go pursue these women. Let us go declare our love to these women. And so let's look at Act 5 then, and see how Biron's ideas in this speech play out. Because here's the thing, the play could end here in a way, right? Biron's values and ideas, he articulates them very clearly here. Ferdinand realizes he is wrong. The men abandon their oaths. You could imagine a version of the play where Shakespeare's characters go off, declare their oaths to the ladies, they all get married, and they live happily ever after. This could theoretically be the end of the play, because Shakespeare has articulated what feels like is his primary point. The characters have changed. The tension, right, has been resolved. The comedy of the misdelivered letters, right, has led to this revelation of everything, revelation of people's true feelings. But this is not the end. And that's what I think is the genius of this play and its structure. Because Shakespeare realizes that even this point that these four men reach because of Biron's big speech, even this is not enough. And so then we get to Act 5. Act 5 is a very fun act. It's composed of, essentially, the men and the women play this game of wits and love to try and win each other. So the men basically come pretending to be Muscovites, pretending to be Russians, to kind of play a trick on the ladies, to sort of play a game, basically. And the women basically disguise themselves as each other. They wear these masks and they exchange tokens, so it's hard to tell which women is which. And so they kind of force the men to basically profess their love to the wrong women. They're basically playing this whole game, this whole dance. And the question is, why are they doing this? What is the point of all of this? Why go through this game of love at the end? Why not just admit they love each other and end it? Again, it's because the women want to assert their authority over the men, and because I think Shakespeare's point is that the men need to be brought low one more time, because the men, even though they now realize that love is more important than knowledge, they're still misguided because they still believe that their words can lead them to love. And the final lesson that they need to learn in Act 5, the final lesson that the women teach them, is what the princess had said in the beginning of Act 2 in her first speech, that words are not sufficient to convey the truth about beauty. And that's going to be the final lesson these men need to learn in Act 5, is in Biron too, is that actually words don't matter, right? That their words, that their sonnets, that everything they write and say, they're not important compared to love itself, compared to seeing a woman, compared to the eyes. It's the final lesson they need to learn. So let's look at Act 5. And the other fun part about Act 5 is that the comedic characters, right? The two, Holofernes and Sir Nathaniel and Don Armado and Costard and Dull, they all perform a play where they dramatize the nine worthies. Again, it's meant to be kind of a satire of this overly pedantic and overly academic lesson, right? Teaching people about these nine great figures from the past. and the play basically falls apart, right? Shakespeare loves a play within a play. A Midsummer Night's Dream also ends with a play within a play. And usually these plays within plays are meant to be satires of plays, especially in the comedies. So let's take a look at Act 5, Scene 2. So I want to look first at Biron's speech, where basically this is after there's been a bunch of witty banter exchanged between them, kind of the game that they play where the men disguise themselves and the women disguise themselves to trick the men. And basically the women win this game, right? The women successfully trick the men. And basically Biron has this moment where he essentially says, you know what? Enough wit, enough games. Let me just confess what I feel. Enough words. And this is a key moment in Act 5 where, again, Biron is the one who expresses the turn in the men's feelings, right? He is the one who experiences the shift in feelings first, and this basically reflects what all the men come to feel. So he says, "Thus pour the stars down, plagues for perjury. Can any face of brass hold longer out? Here stand I, lady. Dart thy skill at me. Bruise me with scorn. Confound me with a flout. Thrust thy sharp wit quite through my ignorance. Cut me to pieces with thy keen conceit. And I will wish thee never more to dance, nor never more in Russian habit wait." So he's basically saying, just cut me to pieces. Your wit, he's acknowledging that her wit is superior to his, right? Her skill is superior to his. He's saying, dart thy skill at me, bruise me, stab me with your sharp wit, right? Cut me to pieces. He's acknowledging that she has won, that she is wittier and smarter than he is. "Oh, never will I trust to speeches penned, nor to the motion of a schoolboy's tongue, nor never come in vizard to my friend, nor woo in rhyme like a blind harper's song. Taffeta phrases, silken terms precise, three-piled hyperboles, spruce affectation, figures pedantical, these summer flies have blown me full of maggot ostentation. I do forswear them." So what is he saying? He's saying, you know what? I'm going to give up words and knowledge. He's saying, I'm not going to trust to speeches penned anymore. Because remember, he has written a lot of letters and sonnets and speeches, right? A lot of the characters have written letters in this play. And Biron is realizing that these letters, these speeches, these writings are insufficient, are meaningless. He has to give them up. This is that final lesson that the ladies teach the men. He's saying, I'm not going to try and trust a schoolboy's tongue, right? He basically criticizes himself and Ferdinand and the others as schoolboys, right, in their obsession with knowledge. And he says, trying to woo in rhyme, writing a poem or a song, it's like a blind harper's song. Basically, the word blind is key there because remember how important eyesight is in this play. The idea that Biron has consistently come back to is that the eyes are the source of love. Seeing a woman's eyes, seeing a woman, but seeing a woman's eyes, seeing yourself reflected in woman's eyes, that mutual gaze. He's basically saying writing, poetry, it's like a blind harper's song, right? You are not really seeing the person. He describes words as taffeta phrases, as silken terms. The idea here is that these words are just beautiful strips of cloth, but they have no substance to them. Three-plied hyperboles, right? He's describing, again, he's using references to silk, references to textiles to describe the flimsiness of his words. Figures pedantical. He even literally calls himself pedantic. And then this is my favorite image or metaphor he uses. He's saying, my words are like summer flies, right? They're like summer flies, and they filled me with maggot ostentation. He says, focusing too much on words, because a fly basically creates maggots. And so he's saying all of these summer flies have filled me with maggot ostentation. I've become ostentatious, like full of maggots. And he says, I do forswear them all. He says, I do forswear them. Forswear is such an important word in this play because it begins with them making an oath. And here, once again, he is saying, I will forswear, I will reject all of these phrases, all of these words, these hyperboles. If we keep reading to finish the speech, and I here protest by this white glove, how white the hand God knows, henceforth my wooing mind shall be expressed in russet yeas and honest kersey nose. And to begin, wench, so God help me, la, my love to thee is sound, sans crack or flaw. So he calls her wench, which is the word that Costard had used earlier to describe a woman. I think that's intentional. Obviously, wench is generally used for a lower-class woman, but Biron is basically trying to strip his language of all ostentation, to bring it down to simply what it is. And he says, a wench, because again, Costard earlier was celebrated for kind of the purity of his approach to love. He sees women as wenches and he loves them. And Biron realizes maybe that's what he needs as well. This is Biron basically letting go of all of the trappings of love that he has tried to use to express what he feels. And he's letting go of all of that. And he's simply saying, I love you as directly as he can. But then, of course, Shakespeare has one final trick up his sleeve. Because you could imagine, okay, now the men have finally given up words. They finally acknowledged love as directly as they can. Maybe that's the end of the play. They watch this humorous, silly depiction of the nine worthies and they laugh. But no, there is one more revelation, one more trick. And that is the princess's father dies. And this is what makes Love's Labour's Lost different from some of Shakespeare's other comedies. The light comedy, the witty, charming comedy that we've been reading dissipates now in the face of death. Remember, of course, this is how the play began, with Ferdinand basically saying the reason we take this oath is in the face of death. We want to, our scholarly knowledge, our scholarly abilities will make us close to immortal, right? We will achieve a kind of eternity through our study and our knowledge, right? It began with this reference to death, and the play now ends with death. And death affects all of these characters in different ways. So first, it affects the princess. There's this really interesting speech from the princess. She says here, she's going to leave, basically. She has to go leave because her father has died. She has to go sort things out. Ferdinand wants her to stay, of course, because they're in love, and she says, "Prepare, I say. I thank you, gracious lords, for all your fair endeavors, and entreat out of a new sad soul that you vouchsafe in your rich wisdom to excuse or hide the liberal opposition of our spirits, if over boldly we have borne ourselves in the converse of breath. Your gentleness was guilty of it. Farewell, worthy lord. A heavy heart bears not a nimble tongue. Excuse me so, coming too short of thanks for my great suit so easily obtained." So she's apologizing almost to the men. She's saying, we're sorry for the liberal opposition of our spirits. We're sorry if we were overbold in our wit, in our jests. I mean, essentially she's saying, yes, we, the four women, we did challenge you. We were witty. We pushed back against your love. We challenged you. We were bold. We had liberal opposition. She's saying it was because of your gentleness. So she's sort of, in a way, apologizing for the way they acted, but she's sort of saying, well, there was a reason we acted that way. And obviously it worked, right? It made the men realize what true love really was, right? So the women's sort of jests and wit worked, but now the idea is there's no more time for jest or wit. Now that death has arrived, now that reality has arrived from outside the play, the princess is no longer the same kind of witty, jesting, bantering woman that she was. And what does she request of Ferdinand? She says basically, what I want you to do is go to some forlorn place, some naked hermitage, she calls it, remote from all the pleasures of the world, and basically stay for a year, 12 celestial signs. And she says, if this austere, insociable life change not your offer made in heat of blood, right, his offer of marriage and love to her, if frosts and fasts, hard lodging, and thin weeds nip not the gaudy blossoms of your love, but that it bear this trial and last love, then, at the expiration of the year, come challenge me by these deserts, and by this virgin palm now kissing thine, I will be thine. So she's basically saying to him, okay, you claim you're in love with me now, but go for a year to a hermitage. Go stay for a year, and if after a year you still feel this love for me, then I will be yours. So she's essentially asking Ferdinand to take up the oath again that he made at the beginning. Not for 3 years in this case, but just for one. And Rosalind asks for Biron to make a similar kind of oath. In his case, she asks him to. Biron has a similar oath he has to make, right, to go try and make the speechless laugh with his wit. It's meant to be this play on his wit. The idea is now the men have to retake these oaths, variations of the same oaths they took at the beginning. But what's different now? At the beginning of the play, they took these oaths in order to study. I mean, they believed that avoiding women and avoiding love and being ascetic would lead them to knowledge. Over the course of the play, they realized they were mistaken. At the end, then, they make the same oaths or similar oaths again, only now they are doing so for totally different reasons. They are not making these oaths to become scholars, right? They are not making these oaths to become, what is the phrase that Ferdinand used at the beginning? They are not making these oaths to become heirs of all eternity or to bait the scythe's keen edge. They are making these oaths because they have fallen in love and they want to be with these women. And the women are basically issuing this final challenge. They are saying, if you really mean it, now make this oath again. And the idea, I think Shakespeare is saying, is that, and this is why the play is not purely a celebration of hedonism, because at the end of the play, Shakespeare is saying, asceticism does have its place. Asceticism has its place, but it has to have a purpose. Asceticism with the ultimate goal of love is worthwhile, Shakespeare is saying. Forswearing pleasure with the knowledge that love awaits at the end is worth it. That makes an oath worth it. The oath that they swore at the beginning, Shakespeare makes fun of, because it was an oath for something he felt didn't matter, for scholarly, pedantic stuff. This oath that they take at the end does matter because it is an oath for love. And obviously, ultimately, that is what a marriage is. It is an oath that you take. It is an oath that you swear. And so some scholars sometimes say, Love's Labour's Lost has an unhappy ending, has a sad ending. It does not end in the same way that a lot of Shakespeare's other comedies end with a marriage. And that's true. The marriage, though, is implied. I think we can conclude that they will fulfill these oaths, that the four men have transformed and learned something over the course of this play, and they will accomplish what they've set out to do at the end, and then they will marry the four women. I think that is implied in the way the play ends. But what I think is really interesting is the way in which the ending also kind of undermines the very idea of a play itself. And this is kind of tricky because so much of Shakespeare's plays are celebrations of the theater. Even the tragedies, right? Something like Hamlet, the play in the middle of Act 2 is the essential point, the essential way that Hamlet is able to catch Claudius, to figure out that he's the one. In The Tempest, for example, right? The whole thing is often seen as a celebration of plays and dances and music and pageantry and rituals, and essentially the play as a kind of magic ritual. Love's Labour's Lost is interesting because in the end, death comes from outside the play. In a way, the play is this kind of contained, closed-off world in which the men and the women can banter about love, in which viewers can laugh, people can laugh, right, and can experience this elevation. But then Shakespeare is sort of saying there is a world outside the play that still exists, and it seeps into the play right at the end, with the arrival of the messenger announcing the death of the princess's father. And there's this great line from Biron at the very end which reinforces this idea, where Biron and Ferdinand are talking, right, about having to wait a year now. Biron says, "Our wooing doth not end like an old play. Jack hath not Jill. These ladies' curtsy might well have made our sport a comedy." So he's pretty directly calling attention to the kind of metatextual idea that this play did not end like people might have expected. Jack and Jill are not together. The ladies could have made our sport a comedy, but instead their wooing did not end like a traditional play. Biron pretty directly acknowledges that. But Ferdinand responds by saying, "No, you're wrong." He says, "Come, sir, it wants a 12-month and a day, and then 'twill end." So Ferdinand is confident. He said, it's just a year. It's just a year, and then Jack will have his Jill, and then it will end in a comedy, and then we will get the women we love. All we have to do is wait a year. But Biron says, that's too long for a play. It's a very enigmatic final line from Biron. That's the last line that Biron speaks. It's a very enigmatic final line where he's not saying Ferdinand is wrong. He's not saying Ferdinand is wrong necessarily. They will, after a 12-month and a day, win these ladies' hearts because they all love them enough to commit themselves to this vow now. But Biron is saying that's beyond the scope of a play. It's an interesting point in which Shakespeare is kind of dismantling, in some ways, the very structure of the play, the very idea of the play. It sounds kind of strange to say, but you might almost argue this is a little postmodernism that Shakespeare is injecting into his play at the end. Postmodernism, of course, is just the idea that you break down the categories and the certainties through art in some way, or you use art to call attention to the structure of the art itself. Umberto Eco famously said in his afterword to The Name of the Rose that postmodernism is really a meta-historical category. What he meant was every age has its own form or variation of postmodernism, when writers or artists will call attention to the structure of the art itself. I think that's kind of what Shakespeare is doing here in this meta-historical postmodern way. He is calling attention to what is a play. What are the limitations of a play? He is saying, yeah, a play has its limitations and a play has to end, but there is life beyond the play. What is life beyond the play? Life beyond the play is death, the princess's father dying, but it is also marriage. And that's what Ferdinand, with his optimistic line, is suggesting, that they will marry in 12 months and a day. So what is beyond the scope of the play? It's not just death, it's not just sadness, it's also the possibility of future happiness, of marriage. But very intelligently, Shakespeare puts it outside the play rather than in the play. And in doing so, he calls attention both to what is a play, but also the limitations of a play in some way. Because what is the ultimate point of his story here, of his narrative? It's also about the limitations of language. And a play, of course, is entirely composed and constructed of language. And if the lesson that Biron learns, if the lesson that Biron and all of the men learn is that language is insufficient in expressing love compared to the look in a woman's eyes, isn't it fitting that the marriage cannot take place within the confines of the play, within the confines of language, that it has to occur beyond language, beyond the play itself? Because that is the ultimate way for the characters to learn the lesson, that the play is not enough, and that there is something beyond the play. All right, with that, I think is a perfect way to conclude. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed Love's Labour's Lost. If you haven't read it, I hope this encourages you to read it and to really enjoy it. And I hope you get something more out of it than you might have before. Love's Labour's Lost is a play that has been written about many times. There's a wonderful interpretation by 20th century scholar Francis Yates, which looks at the historical context of the play and some of the historical references it's most likely making. If you really like to play and you're interested in some of those references, especially to the Renaissance and the world of the Renaissance, I really encourage you to read her book on Love's Labour's Lost. There are many other great interpretations, though. I think it's a play that is far richer than its reputation would suggest. It's not read as widely as some of Shakespeare's other plays, but I believe it is one of his best. As always, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast, and I will see you all next time.